He stood accused, not of a crime, but of believing in God. In a courtroom ruled by skepticism, Elon Musk was mocked by an atheist judge on national television. And when asked to prove his faith, Elon gave an answer that silenced the room and changed far more than the verdict. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Elon Musk stepped into the courtroom with quiet resolve. His dark suit was sharply pressed, but there was no flash, no display, just calm intensity in his eyes. The room, already buzzing with hushed speculation, fell into a deeper silence the moment he crossed the threshold. Journalists clutched their notepads, skeptics leaned forward with folded arms, and a few scattered believers watched him with cautious hope. At the bench sat Judge Hallstrom, a man whose disdain for religious belief was no secret. Known for his cutting remarks and rigid worldview, he looked at Musk now with thinly veiled contempt. His gaze didn't blink as Elon approached the table. He didn't need to say anything. The weight of that stare alone was a message. Elon sat slowly. His movements were controlled, deliberate. On the surface, his face gave away nothing. But his hands, resting on the table before him, curled into quiet fists for just a moment, then relaxed again. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Cameras were not allowed, but the press coverage outside was relentless. Yet what drew people here wasn't just the trial. It was the man at its center, and the belief he might dare to defend in front of the world. The judge finally spoke, voice cool and sharp. "So, Mr. Musk, do you really believe in God?" The judge didn't hesitate to strike first. With a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, he leaned forward and spoke clearly for all to hear. "You're a man of science, Mr. Musk. You build rockets, you measure atoms, you shape the future with code and calculations. What possible place does faith have in your world? Are you here to defend fairy tales?" A ripple of uneasy laughter swept through part of the gallery. Elon didn't flinch. His eyes stayed steady, and after a long pause, he answered, not with defiance, but with something quieter, something deeper. "Science explains how," he said. "It tells us how galaxies spin, how cells divide, how machines think. But I'm not here to argue about the how. I'm here to speak about the why." The judge arched an eyebrow. Elon's voice didn't rise, but each word landed with clarity. "There are things I've witnessed," he continued. "Things no formula can explain. Moments of stillness, of presence, of undeniable meaning. Moments that make me believe there's something more." He looked out at the gallery, meeting the eyes of strangers who had come for a spectacle, and were slowly realizing they might be witnessing something else. "And I know," Elon added, "I'm not alone." Elon took a breath and looked past the judge, his eyes briefly unfocused, as if replaying scenes behind his silence. "I've stood on launch pads surrounded by fire and steel. I've watched rockets ascend through the atmosphere, leaving Earth behind in thunder. I've spent nights in labs running simulations, checking data until dawn. I've walked the edge of what humanity can achieve with intellect and persistence." The courtroom listened, still and intent. "And yet," Elon continued, "somewhere along the way, despite all the sound, the applause, the machines, the endless movement, I began to notice something else. A silence. Not the kind that comes from isolation, but the kind that lingers behind every success, like a space waiting to be filled." He paused, his voice quieter now. "That's when I started asking questions I'd pushed aside for years. Not about propulsion or programming, but about purpose. Why we're here. Why we feel drawn to love, to wonder, to hope. Especially when it doesn't make sense." He shared how he'd begun reading ancient texts in the quiet hours of the night. Scripture, philosophy, even poetry. How, without telling anyone, he had whispered uncertain prayers alone in the dark. Not out of tradition, but out of longing. "I didn't find all the answers," Elon said, "but I found something else. A peace I couldn't engineer, a presence I couldn't reduce to math." The judge shifted in his seat, but said nothing. "I used to think belief made a person weak," Elon continued, his voice strong again. "That it was a crutch for those who couldn't face the world as it is." He turned to the judge, meeting his gaze fully. "But belief didn't make me weaker," Elon said. "It made me braver. Because for the first time, I wasn't facing the silence alone." The judge narrowed his eyes, voice rising above the hush of the courtroom. "You keep talking about belief, Mr. Musk, about peace and presence and purpose. But where's your proof? You of all people should know that belief, without evidence, is just sentiment dressed up as truth." Elon leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but unshaken. "Your Honor, not everything that's real is measurable." A murmur rippled through the gallery, some intrigued, others skeptical. "I've spent my life chasing what we can measure. I built rockets based on fuel ratios and gravitational equations. I launched satellites using physics down to the millimeter. I valued data, rigor, testing, because they help us navigate the physical world." The judge folded his arms. "Then why are we talking about anything else?" "Because," Elon continued, "there's more to reality than what fits on a spreadsheet. When I held my son in the hospital for the first time, I didn't run calculations. I cried. When I watched him sleeping, tiny breaths steady in the dark, I felt something that couldn't be quantified. When the Falcon Heavy launched into the sky and the roar faded into silence, I felt awe. Like the silence itself was saying something." The judge scoffed loudly. "Ah, that's emotion, not evidence. You're describing feelings, nothing more." Elon's gaze remained steady. "Then why do those feelings move people more than your courtroom ever will? Why do people cry at weddings? Why do strangers risk their lives for one another during disasters? Why does a mother feel her child's presence, even when that child is gone?" The judge tapped his gavel once, hard. "Enough. That's poetic, Mr. Musk. But this isn't a poetry reading, it's a court of law." Elon nodded. "And law is built on principles that can't be seen. Justice, honor, trust. You won't find them under a microscope, but you still base rulings on them." The judge leaned in, his voice icy. "You're dancing around the fact that you have no proof. You believe in a God you can't see, a voice you can't record, an answer you can't verify. That's not evidence. That's illusion." A tense silence hung in the air. Elon took a breath, then said, "You're right. I can't offer a photograph of God, but that doesn't mean he's not there. I can't show you the wind either, but I can show you what it moves. I can't measure love, but I can show you the lives it changes." The judge straightened, slamming his gavel down with a loud crack. "This is a court of law," he barked, "not a church." The crowd stirred, some alarmed, others emboldened. But Elon remained still, the echo of the gavel ringing in his ears, and something in the judge's face had changed. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was something deeper, something unsettled, and maybe even afraid. Elon didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he sat forward slightly and spoke with measured calm. "You asked for truth, Your Honor, not theater, not spectacle. Truth doesn't always come with special effects. Sometimes it just needs to be heard." The judge's glare held, but a murmur had begun behind Elon. Quiet at first, like the start of a rising wind. Then a woman stood. She was elderly, fragile-looking, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her cane. Her voice was soft, but every word was clear. "Your Honor," she said, turning to face the bench. "My name is Mary. I was told I'd never walk again after a stroke 5 years ago. The doctors gave up. But my church didn't. They laid hands on me. They prayed over me. And something happened. Something they couldn't explain." She took a step forward, then another. "I walk now, without help, not because of medicine, because of mercy." The courtroom stilled. The judge opened his mouth to object, but before he could speak, another voice rose. "I was in prison," a man called from the back. "For 10 years. I gave up on myself. But a prison chaplain told me God still had a plan for me. I didn't believe him. Until one night, I heard a voice in the silence. Not in my ears, in my soul. Now, I speak to youth about second chances." Then another. "I lost my child. I didn't want to live after that," a woman said tearfully, clutching a photograph to her chest. "But I started to pray. I felt my daughter's peace come over me. I can't explain it. But I live because I know she's with God." Testimonies began to bloom across the courtroom, like sparks igniting dry ground. Believers, skeptics, turned seekers. Broken souls who'd found healing. Their voices overlapped, raw and real. The judge pounded the gavel again, louder this time. "This is not a revival," he snapped. "This is a courtroom." But his voice held less authority now, less certainty. Elon slowly turned to face the gallery, watching the crowd rise with each new story. His voice carried steady over the growing noise. "You wanted proof, Your Honor. You demanded evidence." He turned back to the judge, not with defiance, but with conviction. "It's standing all around you." The room fell into silence once again, not from force, but from awe. Elon looked at the rows of people, some wiping tears, others whispering prayers, many simply standing still, as if realizing, perhaps for the first time, that they were not alone in their belief. And the judge? For the first time, he had no words. The foundation he stood on, logic, certainty, control, had not been destroyed. But something had cracked. Something was shifting, and that crack was letting in light. The judge's knuckles whitened as he gripped the gavel, pounding it against the wood until the sound echoed like thunder. "Enough," he bellowed. "This is a court of law, not a house of worship. I will hold every single one of you in contempt if you do not return to your seats this instant." But no one moved. One by one, more people rose from the gallery, their faces lit not by rebellion but by something deeper. Conviction, sorrow, hope. Some whispered prayers, others wept. A middle-aged man in the third row raised a hand and said, "I tried to end my life last year. The only thing that stopped me was a voice in my heart saying, 'You are loved.' I know it wasn't my own." The judge slammed the gavel again, but his voice cracked this time. "I will not allow this." Spectacle. A woman in her 20s, trembling but resolute, stood. "I watched my mother die of cancer, Your Honor. In her final breath, she smiled and said she saw a light, felt peace. You may call that hallucination. I call it home." Another voice followed, then another, like a rising wave of testimonies, personal, painful, unpolished. Elon stood quietly, letting the wave build. Then he stepped forward once more. Not to shout, not to debate, but to speak plainly. "This isn't about proving God exists," he said, his voice calm, even gentle. "It's about choosing not to ignore him." The judge blinked rapidly, trying to mask the emotion rising in his eyes. "I didn't believe at first either," Elon continued. "I chased numbers, data, theories. I built machines, I cracked equations. But late at night, when the world was quiet and success still felt hollow, I knew something was missing." He looked around the courtroom, at the people who had shared their pain, their miracles, their hope. It wasn't that I needed proof. I just needed to stop pretending I didn't already feel it. A hush fell again, deeper than any silence before. The judge leaned back in his chair, breathing hard. His face was still stern, but the lines of certainty had softened. His fingers trembled faintly as they rested on the bench. "You said belief without evidence is fantasy," Elon said gently. "But maybe the real fantasy is thinking we can go through life ignoring everything we can't explain." The judge opened his mouth, then closed it. Elon stepped forward again, just one step, and lowered his voice. "Even if you don't believe," he said, "you still feel it, don't you?" The words hung in the air like incense, weightless, yet impossible to ignore. The judge looked down at his desk, eyes unfocused, as if the walls of his mind were beginning to whisper truths he had long silenced. Behind him, the people stood, not as protesters, but as witnesses. Each one carrying their own invisible proof, not for the world to measure, but for their own hearts to recognize. And in the stillness that followed, the courtroom became something else entirely, not a battleground, but sacred ground. Elon took one more step toward the bench, his voice rising, not in volume, but in purpose. "Your Honor," he said, "faith isn't weakness. It's not blind obedience. It's the courage to trust in something you can't always see. The willingness to move forward, even when the road isn't mapped by science or lit by data." The room was still. The judge's hands rested motionless atop the bench. He didn't speak, but his gaze never left Elon's. "You've built your life on logic, and for that, I respect you," Elon continued. "But what if logic isn't the whole story? What if some of the most meaningful things in life, love, beauty, forgiveness, are real precisely because they defy calculation?" He let the question hang in the air, turning to face the courtroom. "There are things in this world we can't program into algorithms, things that can't be modeled in simulations or explained by theories. I've seen it in the eyes of a child who prays without knowing why. I've heard it in the silence after the rocket launches, when all that's left is awe. I've felt it when my own doubts were met with a peace I didn't create and couldn't understand." He turned back to the judge. "You may not believe in miracles. You may not trust what you can't measure. But here's the thing. Truth doesn't require your permission to exist." The judge blinked slowly, his face unreadable. "And truth," Elon added, "has this strange way of breaking through. You can question it, dismiss it, even try to silence it. But it remains, steady, waiting." A soft murmur swept through the gallery. The crowd wasn't restless. They were listening, each person holding their breath, as if something more than words was unfolding before them. "I didn't come here to convert anyone," Elon said. "I came because someone needed to say it out loud. That believing in God isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the strength to hope when the world says there's nothing left. The strength to forgive when you've been hurt. The strength to love when it's easier to walk away." He paused, scanning the faces in the courtroom. "We live in a world that worships proof," he said. "But some of the deepest truths are felt before they're understood. Love doesn't come with a spreadsheet. Neither does grace." His eyes returned to the judge, who now sat slightly slouched, his stern composure softening like a clay figure set under light. "You've devoted your life to reason. I honor that. But today, I'm asking you, and all of us, to consider the possibility that reason is not the enemy of faith, that maybe it's incomplete without it." Still, the judge said nothing. "You can silence voices," Elon said, his voice low but unwavering. "But you can't silence truth." The words echoed into the stillness like a bell tolling in the distance. And for a moment, even the gavel remained silent. The judge sat still for several seconds after Elon's final words. His fingers hovered above the gavel, but he didn't lift it. The weight of the room, the testimony, the sudden, unexpected rising of voices. All of it hung around him like a fog he couldn't explain or dismiss. Finally, he looked down, hands clasped on the desk. His voice was quiet. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he said. "But I believe this matters." There was no theatrical gavel slam, just a stillness that settled like morning snow. And then, the simple words, "Case dismissed." Murmurs began in the gallery. Not outrage, not protest, just a hush of understanding. Some were blinking back tears. Others nodded gently to one another. Elon stood from the witness stand, calm as ever, but there was a new softness in his face. A burden had lifted, and though he hadn't come for a verdict, he'd received something deeper. As he walked down the aisle, people began to rise. Some clapped quietly, others placed a hand over their hearts. But no one shouted, no one treated him like a celebrity. Instead, they honored what had just unfolded. Something sacred, fragile, and very real. When Elon reached the doors and stepped out into the light, the crowd outside began to shift. Reporters were there, yes, but they didn't push microphones in his face. Instead, it was the ordinary people who stepped forward. A young woman with her baby whispered, "Thank you for saying what I've been too scared to say." An elderly man, leaning on a cane, looked Elon in the eye. "That wasn't a speech, son. That was truth. I felt it." One after another, they came. No one asked for an autograph. No one begged for a selfie. Instead, they gave something far rarer: gratitude. Not for fame or innovation, but for honesty. For daring to speak what many had buried in silence. Elon stood quietly, accepting each word with a nod, a glance, a gentle smile. He didn't try to claim the moment. He simply let it be what it was. And from the courtroom doorway, Judge Halverson stood watching. He wasn't the same man who had mocked faith at the start of the hearing. The lines on his face were still there, but now they carried something different. Uncertainty, perhaps, or maybe the first stirrings of humility. He didn't speak. He didn't call Elon back. But he didn't return to his bench either. He watched. And as the sun broke through the clouds, casting light across the courthouse steps, the crowd shifted, not away, but inward. They weren't following a man. They were walking with something that had been stirred within them, something personal. Behind Elon, the courtroom had gone still, but within the hearts of those who witnessed it, something had been awakened. The judge remained in the doorway, his eyes never leaving the man who had challenged him, not with argument, but with stillness. He didn't believe yet, but he no longer disbelieved completely, and that, in itself, was a beginning. Elon Musk walked toward his car, the crowd slowly parting around him. Cameras were still flashing in the distance, and a reporter's voice called out his name, urgent, hungry for a soundbite, but Elon didn't turn back. His hand rested briefly on the roof of the car, and he stood there for a moment, unmoving. He looked out across the plaza, where people still gathered in small, thoughtful clusters. Some were praying, others simply stood in silence. A few embraced quietly, as if they'd just emerged from something too deep for words. Then, Elon whispered softly, to no one but himself, this wasn't about winning, it was about witnessing. The car door opened, he stepped inside, but even as the door closed behind him, the weight of the moment remained suspended in the air. In a world demanding proof, sometimes courage is the loudest evidence of all. This story wasn't just about a courtroom. It wasn't about a judge or a verdict. It was about one man choosing not to stay silent when it mattered most. If this moved something in you, subscribe for more inspiring stories of faith, truth, and the unexpected moments that awaken the soul. Sometimes the strongest testimony is simply standing unshaken,